Well, thank you, Conway. And I've just turned on our recording for the event. So to the person who asked about that in the chat, we will indeed have a recording. As Conway mentioned, thank you to everyone for joining us today, especially thanks to Dina, our guest speaker, who will be joining us. By way of welcome, I wanted to share a little bit about myself and a little bit more about Dina here. So I'll start with me. My name is Nikki Yagoda. I'm the Director of Innovation and Partnerships here at the University of Chicago Graham School. Among the programs that I work with is the Writers Studio, which, as Conway described, focuses on creative and effective writing. Today's conversation is part of a public event series that we have been offering recently, where we try to bring a specific skill or genre to prospective students and current students who are interested in learning just a little bit more and previewing a little bit more from our instructors. Today, as I mentioned, we have Dina Elenbogen here, who will be speaking to us about memoir. Dina has published a memoir herself called Drawn from Water, an American Poet, an Ethiopian Family, an Israeli Story, which is a poetry, and that is a memoir. And then she's also published a poetry collection, which is called Apples of the Earth, as well as other award-winning nonfiction pieces and poems. She is the recipient of the 2012 Graham School Excellence in Teaching Award for the Humanities, Arts, and Sciences. And we're very excited to announce that in March of 2023, Dina will be releasing her newest poetry book titled Shore. Please join me in thanking Dina Elenbogen for joining us today. We're going to get started here with a series of questions and moderated conversation between myself and Dina. Yes, congrats indeed. And as we continue our time together, we'll actually do a little bit, we'll hear a little bit of a reading from Dina, and we'll do a little bit of writing together as a group before we ultimately give you guys some time to ask questions. So for the first question to start us off with today, Dina, I was hoping that you might be able to explain what the contemporary memoir is as a genre and how that kind of understanding of contemporary memoir is maybe different or aligned with the historical understanding of memoir.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you all for being here. And thank you, Nikki, for the introduction. You know, I started teaching at Graham School about 22 years ago. And I think this little anecdote answers your question, Nikki. And that is, when I first started telling people that I was going to be teaching at University of Chicago and that I'm teaching memoir writing, many people, especially non-writers, would say things like, really, you're teaching memoir writing? You know, who are your students that they're so important that they've earned the right to write their memoirs? And, people were so confused by this. And again, I think, things have changed in 22 years. So maybe not as many people would say that because the contemporary memoir has become, even more popular. But, what they were doing was confusing the contemporary memoir with what we think of as memoirs, what the politician writes at the end of their career, or an autobiography, or something that a famous person would write. And that is really, a life story. And it's a book about who I met, what I did. And contemporary memoir, on the other hand, breaks off a piece of a life and examines it. So it's not from birth until the present, but it's really just one piece of a life, an experience that the writer had that he or she wants to explore and delve into a little bit more. And it's not about what happened, but it's very much about what the writer does with their experience and what they make out of it. And I think Vivian Gornick is the one who said, you don't get credit for living, but it's what you do with what you lived, how you shape it into a work of art. So I think that's the most important distinction, is that it's not the memoirs and it's not an autobiography, but it's really breaking off a piece of a life. And another myth that I want to dispel is that a lot of people think that in order to write a memoir, it has to be about a traumatic experience or a triumphant experience, but it really doesn't have to be anything but significant to the writer and something that they're willing to really dig into and explore and come up with some sort of universal message based on their personal experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned that there was this kind of perceived reticence when you were mentioning that you were teaching in memoir, because as the administrator, I often hear students, say that they'd like to join memoir or they'd like to explore that, but they're not really sure that they're qualified or that they should. So it's interesting to hear that from both sides. For those who are interested in contemporary memoir or getting started, what would you say to folks that are interested in doing that? And given this acknowledged kind of difficulty in potentially starting out, what would you say gets in the way of folks beginning memoir pieces?
Well, I'll start with what gets in the way, because there are so many things that get in the way. And one is sort of that self-censorship, thinking, oh, I'm not important enough. Whereas, if a person sets out to write memoir, obviously they think that their experience was important to them. And that's really enough. And what gets in the way is feeling like, oh, I don't really have anything new to say. And, I feel like any individual life that is examined and explored deeply and honestly is worth writing about. So I think that's the first thing, sort of gaining that confidence. And in my class that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, one of the first things we do is an exercise with sort of the inner censors that we have, and kind of getting rid of those censors, like having a conversation with them and putting them aside and saying, okay, I acknowledge you doubts, but let's put you on a shelf and let's start writing. So I think that's the important thing. And something else that gets in the way is sort of breaking off too big of a piece and feeling like overwhelmed, because we all know the backstories of our specific stories. And I know I always have the inclination of feeling like, oh, well, if this person doesn't know this or about my childhood or so on and so forth, they can't get my present story. So I think finding a way to integrate, the relevant backstory is really important. And just feeling comfortable breaking off that piece and exploring it. And I think you asked, what does a person need to know as they're beginning? Just be prepared that it's hard work. I think a lot of people will say things like, oh, someday when I, retire, I'll just sort of dabble a little bit and write my memoir. It's really hard work. And I feel like it's a state of mind that you develop over time, a lens through which you look at the world, examining your life. So I feel like most writers have spent a lifetime taking good notes, writing, and really looking at the world in a certain way and feeling comfortable telling the truth. And, that's, we think we know the truth very often when we start out on a subject, but be prepared to explore and to find out, a deeper truth about your experience. And, I have a lot of students who come from other genres of writing where it makes sense to have an outline and to know exactly where you're going. And I think one of the, scary things about memoir is that, you have to be open to letting go and not knowing where you're going. And that's really, the art and the thrill of it is to just let go and start writing and let the writing lead you sometimes. So even if you have an outline in your mind, be prepared to depart from it and to let the writing lead you, because that's really the excitement of, all kinds of creative nonfiction, and memoir in particular is the discovery that you're going to make. If you begin your writing project feeling like, okay, I know everything about this experience and I'm going to put it down, then you're not going to have the joy of discovery. And part of really rich writing is bringing your readers along on that journey, on that discovery with you, so that they can witness that. And, a finished piece of memoir obviously isn't all over the place with the writer trying to figure out what they're trying to say. It's finished thought. But, your early drafts, be open to that kind of discovery. And sometimes it's really hard, painful work. And I think that's something to know as well. And just be prepared, to get whatever kind of support you need, to take breaks when you need to.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think it's interesting to break down the process of what memoir writing is, because it's easy to maybe think, it's about me, it's about myself. There's not as much work as an external research project, but that kind of work that you're talking about, I think, is part and parcel of it. We have a couple questions in the chat, and I want to flag them because I think it really gets to the heart of some of the difficulties that folks have with starting out with memoir. There's the question that when you write about yourself, you're writing about others, you're writing about the other people in your lives. And potentially, depending on what you're writing, it might not be the most flattering, or it might not be how they would choose to present themselves. What advice or guidelines do you use, or have you seen others use, to both deal with those tensions, respect the privacy of your associated characters, and still be true to the writing you want to produce?
Yeah, I think that's probably the crucial question about writing memoir. And actually in my class there's a chapter on the ethics of writing memoir where we deal with some of that. But getting back to process, I would say that in your earliest draft, you need to just write and not worry about what your mother's going to think or what your brother is going to think, but you need to really just write. And that's part of letting go of censors. I mean, our censors are very often the people in our lives who've said, oh, you're not good enough, or don't tell family secrets, and so on and so forth. So I feel like to write truthfully, as you're saying, Nikki, I think you have to just let go of all of that in your earliest drafts, and that there's a time for that later. Personally, I would show what I've written to everybody involved. If I can, sometimes there are complications. Sometimes people aren't alive or aren't accessible. But wherever possible, I would read it back and say, do you feel comfortable with this? The danger of that is that, especially if you're showing something to family members, for example, about your childhood, then everybody has a different story. And so you have to kind of negotiate that. So if your brother says, no, that's not the way it was at all, you can acknowledge that, and you could decide if you want to bring his point of view into your memoir, but your story is your story. It's how you experienced it. It's how you saw things. So you need to, respect that and sort of, negotiate with people and say, okay, I'm going to bring in my story. And if you'd feel more comfortable, I could also tell you your point of view. And I think different writers feel differently about this. I guess my point of view has always been people are more important than books. So if I write something that a person feels is going to destroy them, then I would figure out how to not do that, how I could leave that out with keeping the integrity of a story, or how I could disguise them enough. A lot of people, and I do this as well, at the beginning of a memoir, will explain that they've changed names and identifying characteristics in order to uphold a person's privacy. So that's something that you could do at the end. I feel like if you do that too soon, it could be a slippery slope. Like you're changing somebody's name, you're changing their hair color, like something you're going to be writing fiction. So I feel like in your earliest drafts, it's important to just keep with the truth. And then when you're beginning to think about publication, that's when you start reading things back to people, changing names. But that's, the really challenging part of writing memoir. And, depending upon your publisher, very often they have a legal team, and they're going to be working through that with you as well to make sure that you haven't decimated anybody's character and that there are no legal issues involved.
Thank you. I think that's insightful. Keep those questions coming in the chat for those who are typing them in. We will have a dedicated portion later, but I wanted to address that right now. It would be remiss of me, Dina, to not ask you about your upcoming course. You've mentioned it a couple times, and Dina is leading a memoir class with us starting next week, right? Pretty soon.
Yes.
Would you, would you say a few words about, how you run that class, how you structure it, and what students who might be taking it might expect from that experience?
Yeah, sure. So the class that I'm teaching is called Exploring Memoir, and it's open to beginning memoir writers. I've been teaching this particular class for 22, 23 years now. And so I tend to get a combination of beginning students, advanced students, people who are in the middle of something, people who haven't written anything at all. So we begin with a lot of generative writing exercises, everything from exercises that, as I mentioned earlier, help you sort of get rid of those censors and, give yourself permission to write. we do writing exercises that explore identity, that explore why we write. And then finally, exercises that help you begin to think about what you want to write about in this class. And then, what your general subject matter is, and then what you've come to say about it. We do a little bit later. And the generative writing exercises we share with the group in an informal way. People will share portions of what they've written. We don't judge these. We just point out things that we think are interesting, like, oh, why don't you pursue that idea? And we give feedback like that. We do a lot of reading of contemporary memoir. And then at one point during the course, everybody has a chance for a more formal critique. So in a workshop format, everybody turns in a draft to the group and to me of like a solid draft. It's not an exercise. It's just a really solid draft that has beginning, middle, ending, and that is far enough along to receive good feedback. And each class, depending upon how large the class is, there will usually be about 3 students who are critiqued each week. And, we try to stay away from, I liked this, I didn't like this. And we try to give each other really specific feedback, like this really drew me in, this section confused me, I like the structure that you have, your structure confused me. And we help each other move on to the next draft, basically. And one of the other wonderful things about workshop is that it's hard to see what's wrong in our own writing, but it's very easy to see where other people are going wrong. So, very often people see their own issues in somebody else's writing. And once they've looked at that, they're able to go back and say, oh, you know what, I did that too. I better work on that. And it's really a helpful way of moving forward and encouraging each other, to move on and to really getting a sense of like what is speaking to people. And most importantly, it's usually the group that's able to tell the writer, oh, this is what's coming across. I know you think that you're writing about X, Y, and Z, but what I see is Q, R, and S. And then the writer can sort of go back and say, do I want to, stick with my initial intention and restructure things, refocus so that I am writing about that? Or did my group actually point out what I really want to be writing about and point me in that direction? So, it's a really good way of helping writers figure out what they really want to be writing about and what they are writing about. And so that's it really in a nutshell. It's reading, writing, talking. Every class has become this wonderful community of writers that trust each other and help each other just, become better writers.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that we do intentionally with Writer Studio classes and your classes and other ones is keep them small. And so I'm glad to hear that workshopping kind of element kind of goes throughout. And I think it's been very helpful for other students as well. Okay, you've mentioned that you have published a memoir. I've mentioned it as well. And I know you're going to be doing a brief reading from that memoir in a few moments. But to set us up for that, I was wondering if you might share what the process of writing that memoir was like for you as the author, and also what the process of going from your original genre, which was poetry, right? We see that you have poetry books, you're having a new poetry book. What was the process like going from the genre of poetry towards memoir, which is of course a very different style? And how did that work out in your book?
It's a really long process. I'll try to nail it down, condense it, not take you through 30 years of, work. But I did, one of the things is I didn't know that I was writing a book while I was writing a book is one of the things that happened to me. And I did spend some time, a year in Israel, fresh out of, poetry MFA program. And, so that was my genre. And I happened to be in Israel during a really exciting time when there was this new influx of Ethiopian refugees coming to Israel. And so I was working with them, teaching English to some of the students and just living next door to these little kids, who I fell in love with. And so I was writing in my notebook dutifully. I had in my entire life, pretty much I was keeping notebooks. So I continued to do that and to write poetry about what was happening. but then I wanted a larger canvas. And at some point I felt like I want people in the United States to know what's happening here. This is amazing. And so I started writing, articles. And I'm not a journalist, but I was writing articles about what was happening and, publishing them in America. And at the same time, again, keeping writing about my relationships, my relationship to Israel, to the Ethiopian community. And initially I thought of them as two very separate things. And, at some point I realized that both of the stories work together, that I wasn't an objective journalist or an anthropologist or a sociologist, but really a poet writing in long form. And so at one point, I realized, wow, I am writing a book. And in figuring out what the book was going to be, I did go through phases of thinking, okay, this needs to be straight nonfiction and to just tell the story. But that had been done and that wasn't my expertise. And so at one point I started integrating my personal story into it. And, ultimately, I found an editor who looked at this huge, first draft of like 400 pages. And he was kind enough to say, well, first of all, get rid of at least 100 pages and go put your poet's hat on when you revise. He said, you keep taking it on and off, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't only telling my story, I wanted the larger story. And in doing so, that meant interviewing people who were working with them, anthropologists, sociologists, everything that I wasn't. And, so there were a lot of drafts that I had to go through in balancing out the larger story and my story. And in early drafts, there were too many interviews. And so this kind editor said, the interviews they're in the background, but like tell your story and, keep your poet's hat on when you're bringing in other people and talking about the larger issues. So, getting permission was really helpful to me. Somebody saying, keep your poet's hat on, because other people were saying, get rid of your poet's hat. So it was nice to have that. And it took many, many drafts. But the bottom line was really that this was a story that needed to be told differently, not through images, not through innuendo and nuance necessarily all the time, but there was a lot of research and factual information and personal information. And I hope that I ultimately found a way to have them work together within the book.
Very good. Well, thank you for that answer. And thank you for offering to share a reading with us today. For those of you who are joining us, we'll probably have about 5-6 minutes of a reading from Dina in a couple seconds here. And during that time afterwards, we're going to have an exercise. So if you don't have a piece of paper or a writing implement handy, this would be a good time to grab one. And Dina, when you're ready, I will turn it over to you with my thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to read actually from the very beginning of the book, because, as one of the things I was talking about earlier is just knowing where to begin. And in the end, my story spanned, a 25-year period. It has continued to go on after. So it's good that my editor finally said, okay, stop, But, deciding where to begin was very challenging, because I had the feeling of, this is a community that a Jewish community that came out of Ethiopia and kept their tradition alive for, thousands of years. So how do I wanted that to be known early on. I felt like my experience in Israel before I met the Ethiopians was important. And so I went back and forth with that. In the end, I have a little prologue that I'm not going to read, but it gives the history of the Jews in Ethiopia so that the reader has that under their belt. And, I think it makes a difference as they read on. I also didn't want to begin at the very beginning because it just felt too chronological. So I ended up beginning in the middle. And where I begin gives a little bit about their background, a little bit about my life in Israel before that, my life even before Israel. So it gives a tiny bit of everything. And it's a really short section called Setting Out. And it begins in July 1998. And here's the cover of the book, Drawn from Water. And this is the little boy who's one of the main characters. And another important thing is that this section introduces a lot of the main characters that I come back to later. July 1998. I carry my daughter through Jerusalem's streets. She is asleep on my shoulder. I think of ways to explain why I have taken her to this Middle Eastern country where everything, including time, has been turned upside down. This hot and holy city where she is light against me, where I push her through stone streets in her blue stroller with American wheels, where she stands up for the first time, weeps next to the wall, where in the men's section her father names her Serena Bat Yisrael, Serena, daughter of Israel. I've come to finish the story that is always ending and beginning again. I've come to close the book that is never sealed. I've come to walk these streets with Steve, my husband of 2 years, and our 8-month-old daughter. I've come to see my friends who 14 years ago arrived here from Ethiopia. I've come to see Oznat, my former student, in her home next to the sea, to watch as she and Serena look into each other's eyes for the first time. I've come to see Alad, Batya, and their family that is growing and spreading throughout the country, but always returning to the hearth in Kfar Saba. I've come to see Yael, who has been wrapped in secrets these past 2 years, who has just arrived in Israel. I've come to walk through the caravans where the Falash Mora, whose compound has just been emptied in Addis Ababa, are beginning new lives. I've come to see what, if anything, and then find a way to return to themselves. When I first arrived in Israel in 1984, the questions I asked were more personal. I did not know the drama that was unfolding. I did not know that during the same spring that I received a master's degree, waited tables, and packed my books for Israel, Jews from Ethiopia were leaving without belongings, trekking through Sudan, and in the best of cases, via Operation Moses, making their way to Israel. While 7,000 Ethiopian Jews were taking their first steps onto Israeli soil, I was seeking a way for my life to fit into the country that was unraveling before my eyes. And my life too was unraveling with the landscape that captured me with its harsh, raw beauty. I studied Hebrew on a kibbutz outside of Jerusalem for 4 months. And when I heard of their arrival, I moved to the absorption center in Ma'alot to teach English and to welcome the new immigrants from Ethiopia. Oznat, whom I met as a 12-year-old student, and her cousin Alad, who was 4 when I lived next door to the new immigrants in 1985, would ultimately turn my 1-year visit to Israel into 25 years of returning and retracing footsteps. I would come back to Israel to glimpse the lives of these African Jews and how Israel was and was not becoming the home they longed for. I would come back each time a little older, less idealistic, trying to find the truth about their lives and about a country that I had dreamt of making my home. Meanwhile, I was also growing up in America, where I would return with notebooks full of impressions, arguments for and against making Aliyah, going up to Israel to become a citizen, and photographs of the Jews from Ethiopia who reminded me of the purpose of Israel as the country grew less idealistic and more materialistic. The photographs of Oznat and Alad hanging on the walls of my writing room in America keep the question of home alive for me. And the photographs I've taken over the years of all of us together remain on their walls in refrigerators, waiting for my next return. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, hearing you talk through or read through that excerpt really brings home the point for me, at least, that you said initially, which is that contemporary memoir can be a snapshot, right? That's what I get from that, just the very brief moment. Yes, and I echo the comments that are coming in. That was beautiful. Thank you. Okay, I understand you have a small exercise for us so that we can try our own hand at writing some memoir as well.
Yes. So I'm hearing an echo. Are you hearing that as well, or is that just on my end? Hopefully it's just
I'm not hearing it. So
okay, good.
That's good news, but I know it can be
Yes,
distracting.
okay, that's fine then.
The reason that it echoes is because Nikki's ears are not covered. So Nikki, what's happening is when Dina speaks, your speaker picks up what Dina is saying in addition to what you're saying. So we're hearing it from your end and not from Dina's. That's why Dina can hear it and you can't.
Thank you for saying that. I'll make sure to mute while I'm not speaking.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a little writing exercise just to prove to everybody that you can indeed write memoir. Many of you already know that you can, but if anybody is still doubting that, I have a writing exercise for you that comes from Mary Piffer's Writing to Change the World. And, I think one of the things that all memoir writers need to check in about is identity. That's a big theme that's in the background of a lot of what people write. And so Mary has this exercise that's called Know Thyself. And in it, she begins with a little refrain that begins with, I am from. And that serves as a springboard and allows people to sort of use that to move their story along. And she has 3 rules with that. And one is there has to be something about religion, something about food, and something about place. And I'm going to read you just a few lines from her response to this exercise that gives you a sense of, how she used this. So she begins by writing, I am from Avis and Frank, Agnes and Fred, Glassy May and Mark, from the Ozark Mountains and the high plains of eastern Colorado, from mountain snowmelt and southern creeks with water moccasins. I'm from oatmeal eaters, gizzard eaters, and raccoon eaters. I'm from craziness, darkness, sensuality, and humor, from intense do-gooders struggling through ranch winters in the 1920s. I am from, if you can't say anything nice about someone, don't say anything at all. So you can see she has a variety of I am froms, beginning with place, using something about food, something about her parents. And so I'm going to ask you to do this 5-minute writing exercise by writing down the words I am from and seeing what follows. For some of you, you're going to find that by just writing down the words I am from, you're just going to take off for 5 minutes and, there will be an onslaught of images. And the only thing that you have to keep in mind is food, religion, place, because that also keeps you concrete. And that's one of the things that you want to stay as concrete, because any of these sentences can lead into a full-blown memoir. So for others of you, and especially if you're a little rusty or you haven't written before, you might find that you write down I am from, and then maybe 3 words will follow, and then you'll feel stuck. So in that case, just keep writing down I am from. And I promise you that eventually words will come. Even if you have to, maybe the first 5 minutes while you're in here, you have short sentences or you don't like what's happening. I will say, do try this at home. And, when you don't have a time limit and you're not on Zoom, for some of you, it might work better to just, flow more freely that way. But I think a lot of you are going to be amazed by what can transpire in 5 minutes of just writing down I am from and keeping in mind food, place, religion. And again, instructions are never important. So if you find yourself writing and you like what's coming out and you didn't put down something about food, religion, or place, you will not fail this class. It's okay. The goal is to keep you writing, and the instructions about, food, place, and religion are just to help you sort of bring in rich material and to help you stay more concrete, but ultimately do what works best for you. So again, this is going to be a 5-minute timed writing. And afterwards, we're going to invite you to put a sentence into the chat. I mean, looks like we have 97 people. So if 97 people put their whole memoir in there, it would get crowded. So instead, I'm going to ask you to look at what you've written and find a sentence that really surprises you, that you wouldn't have expected to put down and that you think might lead to something new. And feel free to put that in the chat if you feel like it. If you'd rather not, that's fine. But if you'd like to share your sentence and sort of get into the experience of sharing your work, then please do. Then we invite and encourage you to put that sentence in the chat. Okay, is everybody ready with notebooks, pencils? You'll notice I'm inviting you to write the old-fashioned way, from heart to paper, and see what happens. If this is something you're not used to, then it's sort of a fun exercise to get back to that kind of writing as well. Anything that you wanted to add, Nikki?
Oh, I was just going to set a timer for us. It's 12:38, so I think we'll come back at 12:43. Thank you.
Would you please put the name of the book and the writer in the chat, someone please? Thank you.
Sure, I will.
Appreciate it.
Okay, I'm starting to see some responses come in. I see that we've hit our time, so I'll pass it back to you, Dina.
Okay, one thing I just want to mention, I was noticing there's a lot of specific direct questions to me in the chat as well, and I'm not able to answer them right now, so I'm just wondering, Nikki, you can give out my email to people, and that might be a better way. I could try to answer most of you individually that way, but I can't get back into where you were in the chat, and I don't want to take away from our time. So do feel free to reach out, and Nikki will give you my email if you have a specific question. Thank you. Okay, so some of you put your sentences in chat. Let's see. Nikki, how did you want to go about this? Did you should I read some of these, or did you want to read them, or should we just let people look at them on their own? What do you think is the best method given our time frame?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm reading through some of them myself. It's fascinating to see just the diversity of spirit and experience even within this room. Given how many people we have, I think, maybe we could just read through them on our own. I think there's a great deal of value in that, but perhaps you could say a few words about the importance of this and what it's drawn out, and potentially then we could move to a few questions since I see them coming in.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I want to take a closer look at some of these from fatherhood. I love some of these. I can see that these are bringing in story already. I love, there's dialogue in one. There's some really powerful description. Wow, yeah. It's also amazing to me what happens, how layered the writing can be, even in such a short time period, when you bring in things like place, religion, food. All of those are so much part of our identities, and our earlier identities and our later identities. So I really like what I'm seeing so far. So my advice to you would be to keep going. I can see those of you who've shared what you've written. I can see that you're beginning to write your memoir. That's what's happening. And so keep writing. Think about these really powerful sentences. If you look back through what you've written and you feel like, oh, there's just a lot of mumbo jumbo, but here's the sentence that really works, you could just go back and do this, on your own with that one sentence and see where it leads you. But I think one of the amazing things is how much one can get done in short periods of time. We're working within 5 minutes here because of our time frame, but usually I have students write for more like 10 to 15 minutes, and that really brings the beginning of an essay. And I found that most people, one of the really exciting things about teaching this class is that, watching a piece of writing evolve. And I think everybody loves that, and seeing each other's work, because we listen to these, opening exercises and what people are writing. And then we see sentences, emerge in later drafts, and we really see how the process works for each individual. And that's what's really wonderful. So my advice is, you've begun, so just continue, keep going. And those of you who feel like your lives are too busy to write right now, I just want to remind you that you could write a lot if you do 15-minute increments, 5 days a week. You could come up with an essay by the end of that. So yeah, thank you for trying that and for sharing your work.
Excellent. And I think with that, we will move into our question and answer period. I know we've had a lot of questions come in, and I think Conway has been diligently tracking them. So Conway, if you would lead us in the Q&A.
Absolutely. We do have quite a list here, so I will ask as many as we can get to in the time allotted, but thanks for everyone's engagement in the chat. And again, if you have more questions after the session is over, we are happy to be in contact with you via email. One question about the course in particular is how much of the memoir class will be devoted to improving writing beyond subject and structure memoir, for example, writing strong sentences.
It's really a balance between all of those things. We start out, as I mentioned, doing more generative writing, sort of figuring out what our story is. And in the later drafts, we deal more with improving the writing. So our lens isn't on improvement, the first 2 or 3 weeks. It's on, getting the material out there. But by the second half of the term, we talk about, how to do our best writing, how to communicate in a way that readers can share in our story. And that's everything from how to structure memoir to, sentence level issues. One of the things we don't do in workshop is edit each other's work. So we're not going to be, rewriting each other's sentences, but more saying things like, oh, this sentence is really vague and confusing. Do you think you could rewrite it in a way, to communicate more specifically, what you mean there? So it's really a balance between all of those things.
Thanks, Dina.
Sure.
Rob White asks, can you recommend any online open source contemporary memoirs that could be printed and distributed to students? I teach with a community college in the prison system, and the students don't have access to online materials and only a variety to choose from at their library.
There are a lot of essays that you can get to online. In my class, I use a textbook, actually, the Touchstone Anthology of Contemporary Nonfiction. And you can't access this online, but if you do enough Googling, and if you know like what authors you're looking for, you're likely to find links to many of those that you could print out, hand out to people. But that's, I really can't think of like a specific essay, since I rely on a textbook. Sometimes I will read something that I really like, for example, in the literary magazine Lit Hub, and they have some really powerful memoir. And so you could sort of look in their archive and, print out whatever speaks to you from that and, hand that out. That's one suggestion, is to look at authors that you like and magazines that you like to read that publish memoir, and that, that's one way to begin with that.
Thank you. Peter asks, is the class appropriate for someone interested in writing short story pieces drawn from personal experience?
If what you mean by short story pieces, then I would say no, because usually short story means fiction. So no, it's not a place for fiction at all. It's, but if you mean short essays, truth, then sure. Yeah, we will be writing shorter pieces, because of the time frame and framework of the class. Even if you're working on a book, for example, you'll be sharing something between 5 to 7 pages. And, so if you mean short, true stories, then yes, that would be the appropriate place. If you mean fiction, then no. Then there are some great fiction classes that we offer as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
This may, I'll ask, these 2 questions came in from 2 different people, but they may perhaps are similar. What examples of memoir do we read in class? And what writing models will we read in class?
So as I mentioned, this is our textbook, and I do link you to a few pieces in Lit Hub and some other magazines, but this has, contemporary writers. We read The Fourth State of Matter by Joanne Beard. We read some Joanne Didion, Brian Doyle, really experts in the field we use as our models. We talk about what works. We don't assume that everything is perfect, even in a published piece. So we open it up to discussion and talk about what really drew students into a piece. If there was anything that alienated you about the writing, we talk about that as well. And, you can go online and see the table of contents of the Touchstone Anthology, and that will give you a sense of, who we read. But really a lot of the major practitioners of memoir are in this book, which is why I chose it. We also use another book, which is edited by Jane McDonnell, and it's more of a craft book. And the book really takes you by the hand through the stages of writing a memoir, everything from, as I mentioned a few times already, like talking back to our sensors and generating ideas. There are chapters on how to bring in things like photographs and documentary evidence to spark ideas, and also what to do when you can't remember something, like how the imagination comes to the aid of memory. It's not about making things up, but it's about sort of imagining what might have happened and bringing that imagining into the writing. So these two books, I think, complement each other really nicely in terms of, dealing with craft issues and then just reading some really good practitioners of memoir.
Thank you, Dina. At the start of our conversation today, you mentioned that, 22 years ago, when you shared with friends that you were going to be teaching memoir, they were, thinking kind of, who are these folks to want to write about themselves? And you said that perhaps there's been a change in that response over the last 22 years. And so we got a question from Tom in the chat that says, what does it say about our contemporary culture that there seems to be so much interest in memoir currently?
That's a really good question. I think that, we're living in a time where we're questioning the truth and where we can't take for granted that we're hearing the truth, from our politicians. And people are craving, the truth of their lives, other people's lives, the truth of our country. And, I think it's, I think people have also been sort of educated. I know my friends have since been educated. Nobody would ever ask me why I'm teaching memoir anymore. And if you look at the New York Times book review on a typical Sunday, you'll see that the nonfiction section is this long, and the fiction section is sometimes this long. And I feel like, it's just become a much more popular genre. And, people, we still have our politicians and our celebrities writing their memoirs, and they get a much, quicker and bigger contract from their publishing house, and their books sell better. But, serious readers, I think are craving the memoir. And there's so many different kinds of memoir. And I feel like in the early days, and people still do, every once in a while, somebody still writes something in the New York Times about navel gazers and the narcissistic nature of the memoir writer. But good memoir, begins with the personal and ends up with the global. So we use our personal experience and the details of our lives, not to say, look at me, like, a Facebook post, but to say, like, this is my truth, and I think you could learn something from my experience, and I think you can see yourself in my story. So, for example, Vivian Gornick's famous memoir called Fierce Attachments, that takes place over, decades of walking the streets of New York City with her mother, is a book where you don't only learn about Vivian and her mother and their relationship, but you learn about mother-daughter relationships. And that's the goal, is to have that larger truth. And, that comes with time, I think, in the memoir writing. In the same way, if you begin writing, thinking to yourself, oh no, what's my universal truth? What's global? Then that's going to become a censor. So I feel like you need to just begin telling your story, and in the process, figure out, if you decide to publish it, what are my readers going to get out of this? Like, what will they understand about their lives from reading this? Actually, I had a bunch of undergraduates at the end of a nonfiction writing course they gave me a T-shirt that said larger than life, larger about life. And that was sort of, the point that I tried to bring home to them, is that you want to say something larger about life. That's why you're talking about your life, say something about the human condition in general.
Dina, thank you so much. I think that last set of comments is perfect and sweet way to end our time together. We are just at 1 o'clock Central. And so I know that there are several other questions that came in through the chat, but as we send our gratitude to Dina and Nikki for leading today's conversation in the chat, if you can join me there. There were a few lingering questions about the textbook. So if you could share the textbooks for the course that you're going to use. We got several questions about what the textbook is. Maybe if you could just put that in the chat as we close out today.
Yeah, I think Nikki, it looked like Nikki may have done that. Did you do that or no? Because I thought I saw a link, but.
I got one of them. I got the anthology, the contemporary creative nonfiction, but I did not find the Jane McDonough one.
Okay, so I'm going to write that right now before
Wonderful.
everybody leaves. It's called Living to Tell the Tale. And it's put together by the writer Jane McDonough. And, you know, one of the things, I put too many L's there, okay. One of the things that I hate to say is that it's easiest to get it on Amazon, as much as I want to support independent bookstores, but you can try your local independent bookstore and see if they could get it for you. Some can, some, in some cases it takes a long time. It is available, I know, in Chicago and Evanston libraries, and on Amazon, you get it in a few days. So that's where it's available.
All right. Well, thank you, Dina. Thank you, Conway, for moderating our Q&A session. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. A big round of applause for Dina for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Conway and Nikki, so much for this. And thank you all for coming and for being such good participants as well.
Wonderful. All right. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon. If anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to me. I can get you in contact with Dina, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.